we are generalists through and through. Like, even if we have a more specified role like community ops, somehow we're also exploring marketing, we're exploring socials. And honestly, please compensate your community people if they're doing more than 5 roles at once. I can't stress that enough.
Welcome back to our series on the Chief Community Officer. My name is Todd Nilson with Clocktower Advisors, and this video series is a series of conversations with individuals who have held or hold the Chief Community Officer role, or head of community, or a comparable level of seniority in an enterprise organization. And we're learning all about that set of responsibilities, the skills, the attributes, and the experiences of these individuals to raise visibility about the importance of this role for organizations. And if you are a CEO or leader of an organization that's thinking about the structure of your leadership team, these conversations are intended to give you some insight about what that may mean to bring on somebody who is a professional in the community world. With me today is my erstwhile companion, my friend, my coworker, my co-host on this series, Jay Washington of Birdie in the Hand LLC. Welcome, Jay. Great to see you.
Thanks, Todd.
And our guest today is Raccine Malcolm, who was the Chief Community Officer and People Officer for Dusktree, and is now the CEO of Everyspace. And I'm eager to hear more about that project as well and everything you're doing. Welcome, Raccine. So nice to have you. Hello.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to get into it, and hopefully I can survive this because I haven't done an interview in a hot minute.
Well, I think you'll find we're a very friendly group here. Our conversations are free-flowing, and I think if it's anything like our other interviews in the series, we're going to have a lot of fun, and the time is going to pass well before we realize it and say, wait, that was an interview? Oh, okay.
Yeah, I hope so. Hopefully I don't crack too many bad jokes, you know?
Well, I'm the one likely to crack bad jokes, but I'm very glad you're able to join us today. Thank you so much. I think we met via the Community Consultants Collective, as well as Fractionals United. Maybe, I'm not sure if that.
Yeah, we're in both of those.
I thought so. Yeah. So and in any ways, we had a couple of really great interactions, and I mean, you were gracious enough to accept the interview for this series, and I wanted to learn a little bit more about how your career led you on a path to this more senior level of community leadership role, something beyond community management, and would love it if you could maybe tell us a little bit about your story within Dusktree, and maybe what your path has been up to there, and where you've ended up now.
Yeah, sure. So I guess I'll just give the whole career story from point A to B. So I initially actually started working in the games industry, and I had done a little bit of volunteering there. Through the games that I was playing, I had some exposure to like more customer service-esque roles, and then I had kind of learned a little bit more about community management. I'd always felt like, especially coming from a Caribbean background, that community was a huge part of my identity and what I would probably end up doing. I didn't think it would be formalized like this, but I knew that I wanted to do something that was humanitarian, was philanthropic, something that felt inclusive in a general sense. So I feel like I kind of fell into community through games, and then through that I was able to, better understand the scope of that role and kind of formalize some of those things. So I started out as a volunteer mid-level community manager. Who does that? Who just drops into a career and then goes straight to mid-level? I don't necessarily think that was a great first step for me, but sometimes you learn the hard way, but I don't think it was a bad journey at all. I think it definitely forced me to learn things a little bit faster. But in a general sense, from games, I'd also kind of discovered DEI as a career path as well. And to me, like, you cannot function as a community, as a company, as anything without DEI being intrinsic to that. So a lot of the roles that I had encompassed had to do something with people, and especially like the inclusion of people and crafting actual spaces outside of commercial stuff for people. So I found through very rough and tumble career moves that I genuinely, if it's not a social good organization, I'm going to have a hard time like feeling fulfilled in that role. So I had a little stint at Desperate as well. They initially hired me as a community manager because they were looking to kind of see how community would impact their product. But over time, because it was an early stage product, and they were kind of exploring how they would monetize themselves, my role ended up expanding quickly. And, I feel like for community people, that's a really common story, right? We are generalists through and through. Like, even if we have a more specified role like community ops, somehow we're also exploring marketing, we're exploring socials. And honestly, please compensate your community people if they're doing more than 5 roles at once. I can't stress that enough. Like, I've been having so many conversations with folks around the fact that they're doing 5 roles in one. Even recently, a friend left a really toxic work environment, and afterwards that company posted up the job, and it was like 6 different roles in one, and they were paid relatively like horrible wage. I'm going on a little bit of a tangent there, but yeah. So summary, I started in the games industry, expanded my role to people-oriented things, and then, wanted to explore social good a little bit. I ended up in B2B for a while. It was definitely an okay experience, but I feel better with a product that feels like it's leading the charge and doing something good rather than just selling a product for selling a product. So that's how I kind of ended up at Everyspace. I'd gone through a little bit of a layoff last year, as have many people, unfortunately. And I was, fortunate enough to come across this role, and the recruitment process was great. I thought it was really interesting because I found it off of Wellfound, and Wellfound, even though it's a great job site, sometimes people post really suspicious jobs there. So, I applied. I was like, this is really interesting, but it sounds too good to be true. And then I had a really wonderful recruitment experience. And now I'm here having a good time. I'm exploring. This role is definitely new to me. But I think in my career, one of the things that defines it is a challenge and doing things beyond what my imposter syndrome forces me to believe. And, I'm pushing through it. I really love the product. This is something I would have used in previous roles anyways. And I feel like, there's a lot of impact that can come from a product like Everyspace.
You have just dropped so many gems.
Yes.
God, I can't wait to get in. Like, I'm just
I was furiously writing notes. So this was
Right? No, I went on a little ramble right there.
no,
That's wonderful.
not a tangent at all. I think you took us on a journey, which is what we hope to achieve in these
Yeah.
conversations. And you touched on so many important subjects,
Yeah.
just below the surface of what we're talking about from a leadership standpoint. Specifically for me, things like DEI and B, the value of inclusion, community being a part of your DNA, coming from the
Yeah.
Caribbean and having the Caribbean lineage in your family. I'd love for you to talk a little bit more as it pertains to your journey, how those two things impact your role as a leader.
DEI and community.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. It's really interesting because I when I was creating my user manual for Everyspace, which is like that how-to guide of how to work with me. One of the things that I put in there is like I'm still trying to figure out what my leadership style is. What does it mean to me to be a leader, right? Because I still, aside from imposter syndrome, I feel like leadership is such an ever evolving thing that it feels almost restrictive to put it into a certain box, right? So it's kind of difficult to qualify like, hey, who am I as a leader? I feel like that is as ever evolving as my gender identity. But in a general sense, I feel like outside of that, DEI and community, I've seen the impact that it can have on spaces when it is done from a place of authenticity and not just from a place of, and when someone is really passionate about it as well. I think there's also a lot of stereotyping that goes into the community as well. Like, oh, if you're Black, you should definitely go into DEI because this is your lived experience. I've seen so much discourse around this on LinkedIn. And there was a point in my career where I was like, am I going into this because of my identity, or am I going into this because it is something that I really want to do? And obviously it was something that I really, really wanted to do as well, because again, even as a child, I knew that I wanted to do something pertaining to social good. I don't know how I would have done it, but I wanted to do something pertaining to that. In terms of what that means for me as a leader, I think some of the traits that I really try to embody are like openness. What does that mean? I think that definitely shifts depending on the environment, and especially if you have the ability to craft a company culture, I think you can define what openness means there. But I often think about what transparency means. What does openness mean? What does empathy mean in the context of leadership? And I feel like there's so many ways to do that. Some of the best leaders that I have had experience with have curated their experience per team member, and they haven't just had like this blanket default persona that they use per person. And I've had the best experiences with leaders like that, and definitely taken influence from people like that. Even CEOs that I've worked with in the past that were paid the least at the company. I love that. I love that as a value, and that's something that I'm even taking into this role. I intend to be the lowest paid person at this company. I want everybody else to make sure that they're good. They're able to get food on their plate. They're able to enjoy luxuries. Like at the end of the day, I just want to be able to, feed my family and enjoy, a little comfort here and there. But at the same time, wanting to prioritize employees. And I think that's one of the best things about going through different paths in your career, right? You get to experience different kinds of leaders and learn things you like, things you don't like. And that's why I say that my identity as a leader is ever evolving. There's so many ways I could define it, but I still feel like maybe ask me again in a couple of years and I'll be able to tell you something definitively. But I think it's as fluid as it needs to be, when it needs to be, and who it needs to be for.
I appreciate that.
I appreciate that too. I was just going to ask a little further about that that path that you experienced. So that, as we were talking about sort of the fluidity and how we develop over time. I'm wondering with this series, with that role of the chief community officer and people officer in particular, with Desktree, how did that evolve in the organization? You mentioned you started out you started out your career as sort of that mid-level community manager, thrown in the deep end of the pool with maybe not the level of preparation that you had hoped that you would have otherwise had with it. But how did that translate into that leadership, people leadership, and community leadership role within Desktree?
I think it was natural because I was at a point in my career where I was really looking for more from work, and I think I always knew that I would have been a multidisciplinary person. And I'd gotten to that point where I was like, I need to stop restricting myself. It's okay to be a generalist and explore these different things. And I think it evolved over time. So after my first 3 months at that company, I kind of realized, oh, I really want to delve into people again. I really want to delve into recruitment. And, they were having me do other tasks outside of the scope of community. And there was a point where I ended up as the chief growth officer, growth and people officer. And that encompassed pretty much everything across the board, from product management to rendezvousing with development to figuring out the sales pipeline to managing internal engagement efforts, and possibly planning for future people expenditure when the company grew to a certain point, right? So what does that mean? Does that mean developing more enriching programs? There was a point where I think I was even talking to a language learning service about what their plans are for corporate entities, right? So I think it just naturally evolved. It wasn't like a sit down of, oh, would you like to do this? It was more of me slowly exploring different things on a given day and pulling from my previous job experiences to say, okay, cool. This is what I'm skilled with. Oh, I see there's a little operational flux here. Let me go and fix that. Or maybe they're having trouble with finances or financial management at a point in time. Let me go and play around with that. Or even negotiating payments for things. So I think it was just a collection of me doing a variety of things on a given day, in addition to what I was already doing. That ended up culminating into those roles. And then there was that serious conversation of, oh, maybe I should really have a title that's reflective of that.
Yeah, well, I think that's a wonderful story. So that was a brand new role then in the organization, it sounds like.
Yeah, I don't think there was really a plan for C-suite until maybe early last year.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah, we're finding that in a number of these conversations. For that, this is a role that has tended to develop organically within organizations that see a need for it and see an opening for it, and it is to compliment you about this. It's a result of your skills and your passion and your understanding, and the things that you do that made that role possible. For you in that space. But I'm also mindful of the fact that it seems to me, Jay, tell me if you agree. This is another trend where the people who gravitate well to these roles and rise to the senior level position tend to be these. I don't know the right word for it, poly savant, many skills, doing many things very well. And I think it goes back to something you said at the very beginning, Raccine, which is, these job posts are asking for 5 or 6 roles. It's because a lot of us are good at spanning across, multiple disciplines and seeing the organization from a macro level and being able to act upon it.
I agree. And I think there's this interesting correlation with those on a leadership path who successfully navigated is that they understand that it's one part autonomy and one part support. And knowing how to balance those two things are really important in owning lanes and taking initiative while also seeking out the support and wisdom and expertise of others. I'm curious, on that path, did you find that there was some resistance to your ability to navigate that autonomy and need for support? And how did you address and ultimately overcome that resistance?
That's a really interesting question because I think resistance presents itself in different ways when it comes to those kind of roles, right? And I wanted to also touch on that in terms of the multi-role. I think with community too, even though community has been around for eons, it's only been refined as a career path in the last couple of years, right? Even the advent of the CCO title, that is still relatively new, even though people are functioning in that kind of capacity from way before. I will say I feel strongly about having multiple jobs in one role and not having proper compensation. That's one of the biggest issues I've seen in community as a field. There's still this misunderstanding of, oh, if you're a community person, then you also need to do marketing, then you also need to do socials, then you also need to do sales, then you also need to do biz dev, then you also need to do partnerships. And I think while I enjoy doing all of those roles, I've seen a lot of cases where people are forced to do those roles in those job listings, in those interview processes, and it kind of sets them up for failure because they might specialize in one of those 3, 5, 6 things, and they're not getting the support to actually learn and the space to actually learn all of those other things that are expected of them. There's no weighting of importance on those roles either. So maybe you'll have a community and marketing manager role and there's biz dev and all of those things under it, but they'll never say like, oh, community is 50% of this role, then and break it, right? I think that would make a huge difference for folks coming into that role because they can say, okay, this is how I expect to spend my time and these are the skills that I need to develop over this. So right, there's a level of operational efficiency and empathy that goes into a lot of these things, and I feel like there are a lot of spaces that lack that. So I just wanted to call that there too, right? Like you should choose to be a generalist. You shouldn't be forced to be one, right? So the initial question that you had asked, maybe you might have to repeat that because I went on another tangent.
No, that was beautiful. And I love your pulling in words like empathy and, organizational clarity. And, it just, for me, it was about the resistance. I find oftentimes there are many reasons why people may resist someone taking the initiative and sort of them taking control of their professional journey. And I'm just curious for those who come up against resistance. And there are a variety of reasons why. In the past,
Right.
I've come up to resistance because of my gender, because of my race, because of my
Yeah,
educational background. I mean, there's various reasons why people's own fears, conscious and unconscious bias. And so I've wondered if
for
you've
sure.
encountered resistance and how have you navigated resistance?
For sure. My rambles sometimes make me forget key things, but no, resistance as a point. Yeah, definitely. Like you said, there's so many different forms of resistance that come into play internally. And the scope of that can vary based on the company that you're working with, because sometimes you'll just have blatant racism that you experience in spaces. And then sometimes you'll have microaggressions that almost feel, they almost feel like they're not happening. You kind of feel gaslit in a sense. And it's only after you leave the space that you realize you experience some of those things. And I've gone through that process of working in a space and not really realizing that some of these dynamics are not healthy from the jump. One of the worst things I had experienced was early career when I was working with this company in the games industry, and they were paying me like $5 an hour. And when I had asked for 10, the CEO of that company said that I wasn't worth 10, right? It's ironic to me years later, but that is one of like the biggest, referential points that I have in my career to say I've experienced so much growth over time to the point where, excuse my French, but I'm kind of a bitch now when it comes to compensation. And, I would never let anyone say something like that to me ever again. I do that for myself anyways, but I would never let someone else say that to me. And I would never let someone else say that to anyone else either. And that's one of the reasons why I'd end up starting an early career mentorship program for other folks so that I could fight for their compensation on their behalf, right? Other forms of resistance that I've experienced over time more passively than anything was, witnessing, I guess, racially oriented jokes directed at other folks, or even in, recruitment spaces where someone is like, oh, you're Indian, so you have to like recruit for the tech folks. I'd seen someone saying that to someone else in the tech space. And, stuff like that really reinforces the need for DEI, right? That people make passing comments like that and not even realize the weight of what they're saying. In terms of resistance as it relates to the CCO role, I feel like, all of the intersectional identities that come into play for me caused me to fight a lot when it came to needing to exert a certain level of autonomy in senior level roles, depending on the company. Or even if a new hire was made and they didn't fit the culture that I was crafting, them just being a man kind of made their opinion seem more significant than mine, right? So, and only realizing that after leaving certain spaces, it's disappointing because you would never expect that kind of environment, especially when you're leading the charge for creating culture. Someone else on a similar leadership level can just make one decision and it can cause the upheaval of everything that you've worked on. And I've seen it. We're literally witnessing this in this recessive market. The dismantling of DEI, L&D, and all sorts of departments, even community departments, are being dismantled, and you're seeing the effect that it's having on companies long term.
I wonder, it must be incredibly difficult to figure out, like, when is what is a teachable moment versus what is the sign when it's time to pull the escape hatch and move from that space. It's got to be such a judgment call to have to figure out when to do that.
I think there are definitely some obvious signs, and there'll be moments where it hurts, right? Especially if, again, you've developed relationships with people across the space and, you kind of just let certain things slide because you're like, I love this team. I love this company. I feel at home here. This is where I feel great. Like, things have been consistent. There's like this illusion of security. And then the red flags, they kind of just start looking pink after a certain point in time. And you only notice when there's this repeated burnout and you can't seem to figure out why, or you're feeling dread when it comes to having to log in or coming to meetings with a specific person. You're starting to question your ability, even fundamental, like entry level things that you've excelled at prior to being like, there's so many things that come into knowing when it's time to leave. And sometimes it is so hard to really sit down and say, I need to leave. Sometimes you get booted out. Mm-hmm. And afterwards you're like, shit, I should have left earlier. Because it's just like another level of disrespect on top of whatever you've experienced prior to that, right?
Yeah, no, of course. That it leads me to wonder, the connection between that chief people officer and chief community officer role. They're maybe not so different, as it comes down to it.
People is really just internal community when you think of it. Community is literally at the heart of everything that we do. How are you going to have a successful external community if your internal community is in disrepair? I've seen community managers churn quickly out of roles because even though their community that they built is great, internally they're having struggles along the employee engagement experience and their processes around that, right? So those two things go hand in hand. You can't be a successful external community without having your shit, on point internally.
Love two that. Snaps and a clap, 2 snaps and a clap. No inside is outside. I say that often. If you don't have community internally, how are you expected? People smell authenticity. You know what I mean? People understand that you can either be a used car salesman or you can be an advocate and a champion for something you believe in. Um, wow. Yeah. Got to
That's
sit with that a
beautiful.
little bit. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's hard. This is something that I've struggled with professionally, thinking about like everyone tells you to niche down, to be
Mm,
very
Yeah.
very specialized, very narrow, and stay in your lane, sort of thing. But I feel like there aren't enough generalists, people that are able to sort of look across, the whole organization, look at the holistic health of
mm,
what that space is, and move. And it's one of the reasons I've always hesitated to go down and say like, oh, yep, I'm a B2B external community strategist, and that's what I do.
Yeah. It's
Eh,
like reducing the scope of your skill set. And there
yeah.
are communities that are out here now that are uplifting generalists, even Generalist World, by Millie and her wonderful team. Like I have been seeing their content for a while, and even during my layoff, those were things that helped me fight
Mm,
that same negative self-talk that came up. Like, should I really manage my career like this? Should I have just specialized instead? Would I still be in this position if I'd specialized? And I said this to someone the other day, regardless of if you're a specialist or a generalist, when a recession comes, we all suffer.
yeah.
We all
Mm,
suffer regardless of whatever we do. I think it's just the point of like kind of being able to have your support network and also continuing to trying to find different ways to secure something, trying to find different ways to innovate. And then it's also, and the thing is, I don't even want to say it's fully on the candidates that are in this market either. It
mhm,
is an employer problem.
mhm,
And you
mm,
can see that the fact that we're
mhm.
having so many layoffs, even needlessly, you can see that it's an employer problem. And I keep saying this in conversations that when the market becomes an employee driven market again, employers are really going to feel the consequences of some of the
ooh,
act because they're showing their whole asses right now
yes.
during this recession.
Yeah,
Yes, they are. Yes, they
yeah.
are.
I don't
Re-
think anybody should be in the position to question their skill sets and negate the depth and breadth of
Mm,
everything that they're capable of doing because of what's happening in the world, right? Companies have so much opportunity to embrace these folks long term, and they're choosing not to.
yeah.
Unfortunately, we're seeing some true colors come out,
Yeah.
with this, and I and Racine, I alluded earlier in our conversation to the Fractionals United community. I think that the entire fractional employment movement is another one of those reactions, just like quiet quitting,
Yeah.
great resignation, and all of those movements. I think are reactions to employers behaving badly
Mm,
in a lot of cases.
And I'm seeing, like you said, there's like a lot of traction around the fractionals. I mean, even in the last week, I've seen a lot of people coming up and saying, "Oh, I'm a fractional CCO, or I'm a fractional a chief customer officer, or something like that." I'm seeing a lot
Mhm.
of that popping up, especially within the last couple of months, in comparison to maybe 2 years ago. Very rarely did I see people acting in a fractional capacity on LinkedIn. And now I'm seeing so many people saying, "You know what? I'm tired of this. I'm going to determine what my next steps are, and this is
yes.
what that's going to look like."
Mm. I'm curious, based on this sort of lane of the conversation, do you see the evolution of the community industry evolving, or is it this, as some might think, sort of a niche or a buzzword within the industry, and there's a finite time for community as a role or for an industry?
It's really interesting because I can't definitively say yes or no there,
Mm,
right? There's so many things happening. I'm seeing community tools pivoting to different niches and referring to themselves as like growth and marketing tools or customer support
mm,
tools. I'm seeing a lot of that rebranding across the space. I'm seeing community titles shift and change, and maybe some of them are evolving. It's really challenging to say if this is going to be a buzzword. I know early on in communities, um, when it started really developing as a career path, I know folks are like, "Oh, community is a buzzword," and things like that. But
Mhm.
again, it's been around in so many different forms. I think the direction of community as a whole is that maybe you'll see less titles like community manager over time. Maybe you'll see things that are more specific, or maybe things that are more general, as the generalist movement goes on. I've been seeing some hyper specific titles recently that they never even crossed my brain. Like I saw something like I was having this conversation with someone, and on their LinkedIn profile it said intranet strategy and implementation specialist. I've never, in my career come across someone like that, and that in itself is a form of community operations, right? Because you're doing the architecture of the community space, the internal community space, and that's what I mean. Like we're going to see a wider array of titles. There's still going to be community manager, but I think there's going to be more wiggle room for folks with one, specific skill sets, and two, folks with broader skill sets. Maybe they'll have titles that better encompass the breadth of their skills.
That's interesting.
It is interesting to see the shift in community tools, I will say, because a lot of them are rebranding from community tools as a whole. I don't know if you've noticed that with some of the tools that you might have used in the space before.
Sure.
Yeah, I was just trying to think of the company that you mentioned. Then I was like, I just read something recently.
Was it Threado?
It might have been Threado.
Mm-hmm. I was even thinking about Gainsight, in customer experience.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
That they're an example of sort of like renaming it. And I think what's been running through my head as we've been talking about this, that whole idea of the fractional movement being a reframing of an employment category. I'm wondering if the stresses of so many people within the community professional space of people being jettisoned out of organizations is another stress point that becomes an option for us to reframe what we are, and maybe there's some new term or as you said, like maybe there's a bunch of job titles that are around that. That's a wonderful insight. Thank you.
Yeah. Pre-COVID, I was very keenly aware of like the rise of the gig economy, like that language was very prevalent. And then the pandemic happened. And as we came out of the pandemic, that sort of evaporated. And now I'm hearing this sort of the conversation around fractional in the same way. And so I'm like, is it six of one, half dozen of another? Is there a distinction between the two?
It's interesting. I feel like there's there's like a cyclical nature to a lot of these categories, right? I think it's the same thing being rebranded over and over again.
Me too.
I would say freelancing is similar to, being fractional in a sense, right? Except I feel like in terms of my limited understanding of being a fractional CCO or whichever title you're utilizing for that, is it kind of feels like a more long-term engagement, and it kind of feels more solid than freelancing. Maybe you get equity as a fractional, as opposed to with freelancing, it's more so just like the hourly or day or monthly compensation. With fractionals, there seems to be like a greater scope and responsibility and like a greater range for compensation there. But you can totally correct me if I'm wrong in that, because I'm still new to that space and I'm still exploring communities around that. But it's interesting to see how people define fractionals to themselves. So I would be interested to hear how you two define being a fractional.
Yeah, it's interesting. My perspective from the time that I've spent in the Fractionals United community run by Karina Michaels is she has a very specific definition about it on the spectrum of from freelancing or contracting through consulting, through advisory services up to fractionals. She's almost sort of laying out a hierarchy of different types of categories of independent work. And, for her, she talks about it as sort of being retainer based and tied to incentives and tied to, part-time, it's usually like 1 or 2 days a week or something like that, maybe 3 days a week for that work. And equity is maybe some element of that. But like all structures like that, there's a lot of gray spaces between the categories.
I wondered if it played more along the lines of like fractional consisted of more senior level roles, like you weren't an entry level fractional entity, like you had to be of a senior level.
That's really interesting, because I do see more senior folks doing fractional as well.
I think that's definitely a way that movement has tried to shape itself or message itself along the way. And so I think to recontextualize this in the conversation of the CCO role, this has been fascinating. I love it, and I think it's very relevant. One of the things that's been in the back of my mind around this is that because CCO is such a new concept for a lot of organizations, is this kind of position more suited to fractional kinds of situations as opposed to a company, a C-suite, a CEO saying, you know what, we really need a chief community officer, as a full-time role in the organization? Or is that a diminishment of the role and its response? Can you do it in 1 or 2 days a week? That I don't have answers. It's a wicked problem. I don't have answers in my head
Yeah.
around
It
it.
is.
I'm trying to figure it out.
Yeah, I wouldn't even know what to tell you there, right? Because there's so much nuance to that. I think you can see success depending on the scope of your company. Like maybe an early stage startup or a seed stage startup would probably do better with a fractional CCO,
Yeah.
maybe, or maybe they would do better with somebody more hands-on. And that also coincides with the stage of their product, right? You can be a seed stage startup if you're doing the VC route, and maybe you have a pretty successful product and you see that community is something that aligns with your product. Maybe you're going to need to bring in somebody full time as opposed to having a fractional that's coming in once or twice a week. But then that also depends on the nature of the CCO role, because I've seen hands-on CCOs, I've seen strategic CCOs, I've seen all-in-ones. So I think there's so much nuance there, and it's kind of difficult because a scale up with 50 employees and they have a good product, but maybe community isn't right for them. Why do they need a CCO? Is it to maybe introduce it and reframe their product to be something that aligns with community? And then what does that look like, right? Is that more consultancy type work? And do you need a consultant and not a fractional? Like it's definitely a big problem, and it's something to dig into. I think having a framework for that and developing a framework there would be very relevant in this case, as people are kind of exploring the importance of fractionals in the space and getting a better, more linear understanding of what is a fractional and at what point in your business do you need a fractional, rather than just kind of associating with consultancy and advisory, which are two different capacities, or freelancing, which is something else as well. Like, I think it would be interesting to have a framework developed there. Maybe that's something we can work on with different communities that have that expertise, similar to how FeverBee and other community consultancies and community spaces have developed frameworks for community as a career path. It would be interesting to see the same thing for a fractional, right? Is it, like Jay said, is it limited to seniors? How would you then work your way up to a fractional level if you wanted to, or if you're aspiring to?
Mm-hmm. I love it. Yeah. What does that path look like? How does that work?
Yeah, it's interesting. Do you do you need a freelancing background or a contracting background to then kind of be prepared for being a fractional? Would it be good to have like some advisory experience? Like, what does that look like? Do you need to have a strategic component to what you're doing to be able to function in that role, or can you just be an executor? Right? It's very interesting.
I'm curious, based on this conversation, what does your professional evolution look like? I mean, for many, CEO is the epitome, like it's the
Yeah.
end goal. Is that the case for you? And if not, where do you see you going in the next 5 years?
Why'd you ask me that?
I don't know. I don't know.
But on a serious note, though, that's a really good question. It is something that I often think about, even in the capacity of this role. I don't think there needs to be an end all be all for careers. I know this is like the stopping point for a lot of folks. They're like, okay, cool. I see this as like my long-term thing. This is all I'm going to do. But I don't necessarily see this as a peaking point for me. This is amazing. I'm still like flabbergasted by this role as a whole, and the fact that I'm able to sit in this kind of space, and it feels like a really good thing for a generalist, because you can do a bit of everything. It can also be overwhelming as well. But what I'm thinking of doing long term is, I think at the heart of this, and I know a lot of folks who are also Black can think, often think about financial independence and living outside of that. How how are you able to achieve that point without having to adhere to that, 9 to 5 or more than 9 to 5? Maybe you're working a 7 to 10 or something like that. How do you go beyond that point? So there's this aspect of like self-sustainability. Does this mean I go buy a farm with my partner? I don't know. But I think about like freedom of time and flexibility and what that looks like,
Yes.
still being sustainable. And does that mean that I focus more on, like, after this role, like, do I focus more on advisory roles and like garnering equity through that, so that I'm able to still support folks while also being able to have, a different kind of work-life balance,
Mm-hmm.
right? I wouldn't say it's better or worse, but it's different. It allows me to explore existing in a different way. So, I think there's so many ways that I see things moving forward from this. This could mean taking on another CEO role after this and continuing to be an operator, in a sense, because that's really what this role is. I'm an operator in a CEO role. So does that mean I continue being an operator and working with other companies to, scale them up? Does that mean I completely pivot to advisory and maybe, do operational stuff in like a smaller capacity? I don't know, but I think my biggest thing is like being able to get to a point of true financial freedom and also like personal freedom as well, and being able to have that kind of work-life balance that is almost as fulfilling as my work, right?
Yeah. I think there's a difference between a plan and expectations. So what
Yeah.
you've described is a plan, and plans offer you the opportunity to pivot, to pause, whereas expectation has the prong of emotional investment and are kind of harder to pry away when
Yeah.
things don't go as you hoped. And so I love that you have a plan, but no expectations moving
Yeah,
forward.
I try not to. I think it's hard too, because you would know this from that Caribbean background as well. Like there's this expectation of perfectionism and like this kind of definition of success that's kind of pushed on you from early on, societally and even
Yep.
within your own family. And so you kind of grow up with this level of perfectionism that's almost oppressive. And of course, it would be oppressive because we know the roots of that, right? So kind of trying to grow out of that, I think also means not placing certain kinds of expectations on yourself. I think it's okay to have expectations, but realistic expectations. Like
Mm,
perfectionism in a certain form can be so restrictive and not allow you to really explore yourself and your options and really even explore different plans. And I think it's an ongoing struggle to try and break free of that mindset. So it's interesting that you're saying that, I seem to have no expectations, because there are like 5 million different thoughts flowing in my head. Like, what do I mean buy a fucking farm? Do you know how hard it is to get a farm operational?
Me there. You go with the flow.
Yeah,
Well,
I think that's one of the best things to do or try to do.
well, I feel one thing very much in my soul, that if you decided to turn your hand to a farm, you'd be very, very succcial at it.
I hope so.
So,
I'd buy
uh,
your eggs. I'd buy your chickens.
absolutely.
And we'll see. And I think I think it's good to have aspirations outside of your work as well. It's very easy to get caught up in your career trajectory. Even to this day, it's something that I often think about. Next steps, what's next? And always chasing myself and competing with myself. But there's a point where it's good to aspire to just be soft. What if I want to frolic in grass and just have tall grass at the back of my farm and just
Absolutely.
have like a nice little horse named Deborah? I don't know why the horse is named Deborah, but that would be nice to just pointlessly have a horse, right?
I think you're speaking on mindfulness, which is a core component of my professional and personal, makeup. I work for a
Yeah.
mental health and a mindfulness company, but very much clear about being present and in the moment and being okay, grace and gratitude. All of those things are core requirements in that planning and processing.
And it's hard. It is hard to
Mm.
shift out of that mindset of I need to continuously be working, because even when I think of like, what if I'm able to retire early? What am I going to do after that? What if I choose not to work? What am I going to like? Is still being in that mindset of having to be hyper productive. How do we shift out of that? How do we shift over being constantly overstimulated and overwhelmed and overproductive and not getting enough rest? And it's interesting to have these conversations with folks, because you hear this fear of being relaxed, of not doing, of not, you know, having to like fight to survive constantly. There's, you know, it's almost gut wrenching almost, because it feels like we're all functioning at that level regardless of where we are on the, you know, in our career paths, whether we're earning multi-millions of dollars or if we're, you know, just getting to six figures, or if we're entry level. It almost feels like there's this element of, there's no point of freedom, there's no point of like, I can actually relax, I can actually kick back, I can actually have like 12 dogs and not have to, you know, worry about that. Just let them run free in tall grass. I really love tall grass. But no, seriously, like it all feels like, even when we have this feeling of, oh, I finally gotten to the point where I'm thriving, it's so easy to fall back into that survival mindset, even when we don't need to. So trying to unlearn that, trying to explore that, and dismantle that is an ongoing, lifelong process, because from birth we are indoctrinated in this hyper work, hyper productivity mentality. Even seeing countries raise the age of retirement to 70. Who the fuck wants to work when they're 70? You're walking around and
I know.
maybe your joints aren't what they used to be, and they expect you to go and do any kind of work, rather than if you choose to have children and they have children. Like, you can't spend time with your grandkids, you still have to be working. There are no sustainable forms of just being able to exist and thrive. We're always in the survival mindset. So I think about that often.
Well, I think what's so amazing about what you shared in such a very real and
Yes.
illustrated
Yes.
way is not only like the principle of remaining in an agile mindset of sort of recognizing there are many paths available, but also that importance of having an identity outside of your professional self
Ooh.
for the purpose of resiliency
Ooh.
and
Yeah.
and the way you described it in terms of your life and sort of, yeah, I want to frolic in the grass, I want to have a horse named Deborah, you know, it's just so
That's the highlight of
powerfully,
this conversation.
yeah,
I
it's
now
just
No,
want a
but
so
horse named
intentionally.
Deborah.
But this is a common issue in the community space. We become our communities, and we can't
Ah.
turn off. We literally become our communities, and we can't disconnect. And it's a common issue with community management folks across the spectrum of their roles. Even if you're in a senior role, you're still going to want to be involved in your community. Where is that point of like, I'm not my community? Because now when you've been fired or laid off, or maybe you switch jobs, it's hard to dissociate from that identity. This is why I try and develop hobbies and log off. Last year I did like a little metal gig with a friend, and it's like this thing that I try and do consistently. And maybe I'll form a band. Like, I have two folks that, you know, I might form a
tell me
band with.
about
So I
this.
think,
Yes.
huh?
I remember you mentioning this to me on a prior call. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. And I can send you a recording of a rehearsal recently. It was fun. And
Yes.
it's the funniest thing, because when I go to shows and I make the sounds that I make, people are like, oh my God, you're so tiny. How do you do that? But yeah, no, on a serious note, how do you dissociate from your work? How do you live outside of that? And that's something that I struggle with as well, even as someone that's developing these hobbies. Even when I'm at the hobby, this is me on my phone checking my emails, even though I don't need to. I went on a birthday vacation with my partner, and like, needlessly checking my emails, checking Slack, during moments where it was unnecessary. And that's something that we've even had to talk about, right? So I think it's a problem. It's not something that we should be proud of. I don't think we should be proud of workaholism. Like, I make jokes about it, but I think it's genuinely something that needs to get under control. Like, how are you going to be present and there for the people around you, and not even just that, but there for yourself, and able to be self-aware in a way that's helpful for you and allows you to actually empathize with yourself? How are you going to do that if you're constantly, your every other thought is work? Oh my God, I haven't checked in on the community in an hour. I wonder how they're doing. Oh, I need to prep this for, like, it's just too much. There's a point where, you're going to burn out. And a lot of the community folks that I know have burnt out multiple times in their career, and it's normalized. And I don't think it should be normalized.
It's definitely not right. Yeah.
I think we've all probably experienced that in different capacities at some point in our career.
Yeah.
Still recovering from burnout for sure.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Well, Raccine, as I predicted, an hour has shot by before we even
Honestly,
recognized what happened.
I saw the recording time. I was like 49 minutes. Didn't we just start talking?
I know. We just started. We just scratched the surface. Like so many of these interviews that Jay and I have been privileged to be able to conduct together, there are golden moments that come out of each one of these conversations, and this was no exception. You have some brilliant insights. You are an admirable professional in the work that you do. And I appreciate hearing your story, and I'm grateful for you sharing it with us.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Today.
I'm an aspiring good human, and that's what I live by.
Yes.
You know, hopefully at some point I'll be a good human, but I'm aspiring to be, you know.
We all should be so
I live
lucky.
by that. I live by that in my career as well, right? Like we try and do our best, whatever that looks like.
Well, according to the laws of manifestation, you claim it and you own it. So not
Yeah.
are you trying, but you are, and so be it. So be it.
Thank you.
Done and done.
Yes. Yes.
All right. Well, with that, for those of you who have joined us, we would love to hear your comments, your ideas, your questions for Raccine, for Jay, for myself. We are interested in your experiences. And if you're if you're a CEO and you're thinking about this as a role for your team, that people role, that community officer role, you know, to an extent, the title doesn't matter so much as the skills and the people that you are looking at to enhance and grow your organization. We'd love to hear your questions and your responses and ideas to this. So thank you for tuning in. If you stuck with us for the hour, I think you are the richer for it because this was an amazing interview.
Yes.
And join us for the next installment. We have more to come.
Yeah. Till next time, take care of yourself so you can take care of the community.
Bye.